So the first question is, what happens to the chain as you add hardware?
Yeah, so this is really kind of important because for the last many decades, the way compute infrastructure scales is you just throw hardware at it. You don't like spend a lot of skull sweat trying to squeeze every last cycle out of the code. I mean, people do that too, but the real way that systems are scaled these days is you throw more and more hardware at it. And so if your chain doesn't get faster when you add hardware, then it's not scaling. And I think, there are a bunch of proof of work networks who shall go nameless, where it's kind of anti-scaling. As you add more hardware, more nodes in the network, it doesn't get faster, it actually gets slower. And so there are these anti-scaling patterns, and if this is where people are putting their money, it's you know it's a shame. I hate to say it, but it's a shame. And so people really ought to just evaluate this common sense thing. If the software gets faster when you add hardware, I mean, the system, the network gets faster when you add hardware, and the software supports that kind of scaling, then it's a good bet. Otherwise, you really want to take a second look at that.
So what is it then about RChain's technology that allows it to scale when you add more hardware?
So it's the unique combination of the Casper proof of stake consensus algorithm together with the Rolang execution mechanism. So the proof of stake makes the consensus a lot more efficient. But even if you have an efficient consensus mechanism, if you have to sequentialize the transactions end on end, then you are spending more time than if you could run them side by side. So just like the freeway model, right? So if I have to put the cars end on end like this, right? Then as opposed to running them in parallel, um, then I spend more time on the freeway. And you've seen that if you have 8 lanes of traffic and not too much lane crossing, then you get roughly 8 times the throughput of a single lane of traffic. And the fact is that most transactions are isolated.
Okay, so second question is, what happens to the chain as you add more smart contracts?
Yeah. So there are two aspects to this. One aspect has to do with being able to execute those smart contracts in an efficient manner. And the other has to do with the reliability of those smart contracts. Like, are the smart contracts themselves reliable? And what kind of security and other kinds of guarantees you can offer. So in terms of the first thing, if your execution model is run this contract and then that contract and then the next contract, so it's sequential. Um, Again, most of these smart contracts are going to be isolated to a particular sort of collection of resources. And so if you're running them end on end, you're wasting a lot of time. But if you ran them in parallel, then you would provide a much better throughput for the overall system. And so, again, if you're asking questions about where to put your money,
Mm-hmm.
you wanna ask, does this chain have the ability to provide this kind of concurrent mechanism? And this is true not only for just straight up smart contracting systems, chains, but it's also true for chains that are are coordinating chains or parachains or Internet of Chain kinds of things. And the reason is because the coordination is going to be at least as complex. So an example, there are many examples that were explored in the relaxed transaction processing literature from the 80s. So the complexity of the coordination mechanism has long been established,
Hmm.
and and any chain that is betting on the complexity of the coordination being smaller than the complexity of the side chains will be sorely mistaken. So let's give an example, right? So you could imagine that there are that the land use market, land title, land ownership, that kind of thing, that settles on a particular set of chains, and that the credit market settles on a different set of chains. They might overlap somewhat, but they're somewhat different. So in that case, someone who's doing a loan approval system, they want to run both a title check and a credit check. So they want to go out to two different collections of chains, and then based upon that, those results make a determination about whether or not this loan is, got some kind of pre-approval or more serious approval. And obviously, that kind of system will have much greater throughput if you don't have to run the title check and the credit check end on end, if you can run them concurrently as opposed to sequentially. But also, you want the transaction, the wrapper transaction, the loan approval transaction, to fail if either one of those fails. But there might be some mitigating circumstances. So, for example, if the credit check comes back, but there's been some credit repair process, then you might go ahead and approve the loan anyway. So you can see how we can quickly take the complexity of the coordinating transaction as complicated as you wish. And so the parachain, the chain that is running these overarching transactions, is going to have to deal with that logic, and it's going to have to provide transactions that overarch these other transactions. Another example comes from the travel industry, where you have some chains are providing access to air travel. Some chains are providing access to the hospitality services like hotels and Airbnbs and those kinds of things. And some chains are providing, say, rental car. So someone goes up to the coordinating chain and says, I want to book a trip, and I'm happy to redo the transaction if any two of them succeed and one of them fails. So that coordinating logic, it's going to be much longer if it has to wait on each of them end on end, and then it's going to be even more complicated, or it can become as complicated as you wish, depending on how all the kinds of business exceptions. So, for example, you could imagine that the client only wants to fly on airlines that are doing a COVID negative test for all passengers, or the client only wants to rent electric cars unless there's a hybrid car that's below a certain price. So you can kind of see the point here is that you can make the coordinating logic, which is transactional, as complicated as you want. And so you're going to need not only the concurrency, but you're going to need a Turing complete system in this coordinating logic. And this is dual to what I was saying before, where you run these smart contracts in parallel, right? Essentially, the ability to run a bunch of things in parallel and collect and collate results is one of many design patterns that's associated with these kind of coordinating technologies. And so this is really at the heart of the question: what do you do if you're executing a bunch of different smart contracts? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Um, so a lot of these other technologies that involve um, gathering or collecting, aggregating different chains or different smart contracts from different sources um, uh, are going to run into much more complex issues than they anticipate.
That's correct, right? So, for example, you can't push the coordinating logic down to the side chains.
Right. You can't push the coordinating logic down to the side chains. The coordinating logic has to happen at the um, layer one,
Well, it has to happen at the confluence of the different chains.
at the confluence of the different chains.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. So like because the airline chains are not going to have any visibility to the hospitality chains,
Right.
and their transaction model and security model may be completely different. So the coordinating chain is going to have to manage all of those vagaries and provide transactional semantics. Either the trip is booked or it's not.
Okay. Cool.
Right. Yeah. So thank you. Now that was just part one.
Okay. Right. So, okay. What's part two again?
So part two, I think, actually relates to your third question, right?
Okay.
I think let me guess, your third question says, what happens if people introduce bugs into those smart contracts?
That is the next question.
All right, so we're set up for that. So um you could have the core protocol written by angels from heaven. So there's no bugs, it's perfect, and it is as efficient as it can possibly be. But there are all these pesky humans, flawed humans, that are writing the smart contracts against this perfect global computer. And they're going to introduce bugs. And we've seen it happen, right? I mean, we've seen it happen in the industry over and over and over again. And I warned that it was going to happen. And I proposed some solutions to prevent it. Sadly, not before it happened. So the one I use hold up as an example, because it's so well known and because it's so easy to describe, is the DAO bug, where the DAO contract, I think, had acquired 150 million worth of ETH in the to the contract, and then someone found an exploit and drained 50 million. And Ethereum's saving grace at the time was that it was so slow. Right? They were clocking 7 to 10 transactions per second in that time period. So imagine what would have happened if they had been running 40,000 transactions per second. In other words, they were running at Visa speeds. So all of the value of that contract would have been drained in a second. So, and you have to ask yourself seriously, like if you're an investor in blockchain technology, especially smart contracting blockchain technology, you have to ask yourself seriously, is that a safe investment?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Have you heard anything that's going to suggest that there's a response to that, or there's some kind of safety valve for that kind of thing? So it turns out that there are technologies, and those technologies are getting mature. They're at least a couple of decades old. There are abilities to check your production code for certain kinds of properties. So, for example, in the case of the DAO bug, if it had been rewritten in a coordinating language like Rolang that has concurrency built in and has a certain kind of syntactic and semantic structure, then you could check the code statically without having to run it. You can just look at the code and see that these kinds of errors are present in the code. So in particular, the reentrancy error of the DAO bug becomes a race condition when written in a language like Rolang. And that gives, and you can check for race conditions statically. And so what would have happened in the case of the DAO is you would have, the compiler would have said, sorry, this code doesn't compile, there's an error. And so the code would never have been checked in, let alone deployed. So there's an inflection point for blockchain 2.0. If the next wave of blockchains delivers, say, Visa level speeds or above, then that is more dangerous. And this is what I was arguing about with respect to Ethereum. It's actually more dangerous to have these smart contracting platforms at those speeds without these additional security checks, security measures. So I'm like, the way I think about the safety of software is, if this software were an air traffic control system, would I put my daughter on the plane?
Yeah.
And so when we get to that inflection point where these blockchains are regularly clocking at Visa level speeds, you really have to ask yourself, am I going to, bet my retirement fund on whether or not these things have this security measure? And if you haven't heard anything about these kinds of security measures, then you're really flying by the seat of your pants.
Wow. All right. Well, that's great.
So that's our 3 questions.
Yeah.
Awesome.